Hey, what is up, mortals? It is Robo Celestial here with a new video for you. Welcome to What If Deku Could Use Haki. I just wanted to greet you guys by just saying, sit back and relax, you're in for a treat. The crowds were roaring, and the stadium was packed full. Cheers and bellows filled the air. Even when nothing was happening, the day had come, and spirits were about to be tested. The sports festival was finally in motion. The stadium was livid and filled to the brim. Many different faces, pros and many more, were seated to observe what was about to play out. One of these faces wasn't a pro hero, or even associated with UA at all. It was the face of an elderly man with silvery hair and a trademarked smile. He was observing the stadium carefully, using more than just his eyes. He also couldn't wait for things to start, for he wanted to watch his student fight his heart out. "Mr. Rayleigh, how are you doing?" someone called to the old man, prompting him to turn and face it. What Rayleigh saw was a familiar skeletal figure with blonde hair, wearing a suit. "Blondie, good to see you," Rayleigh answered the deflated hero. All Might smiled at the silver-haired geezer before he asked, "So, are you excited?" With a joyous voice, Rayleigh's smile grew wider as he answered, "Of course, I want to see Izuku win." With a loud voice, All Might giggled at the reaction, finding it amusing. Before he spoke once more, "I heard that young Midoriya didn't want to use support items. Can he still win?" the blonde hero asked, being a little more skeptical now. Rayleigh suddenly wore a blank expression. As he turned his gaze towards All Might, he stared at him for only a few seconds, before he smiled and giggled as if the skeletal man had said something ridiculous. All Might looked at Rayleigh in a state of confusion, before the silver-haired geezer responded with a question of his own. "Does your hand still hurt?" All Might was thrown off by this answer, only to tremble and enter a cold sweat. He immediately remembered that he nearly broke his hand just by punching Rayleigh's Haki-infused face. The deflated symbol of peace looked at his trembling right hand, still remembering the pain, as he realized that Izuku could potentially deliver that pain to his opponents. "Well, there's your answer," Rayleigh then said, taking the blonde man's sudden silence as a yes. Class 1 had all gathered in the locker room, waiting in anticipation for the festival to officially begin. Some of them were chatting about various subjects, some were firing themselves up, and some were trying to calm their own nerves. In the middle of it all, however, was a certain green-haired boy. He seemed to be calm and collected, at least on the outside. On the inside, he was feeling a little bit nervous, but he was actively suppressing it while he was stretching. The only thing that kept him nervous was the fact that he would stand in front of thousands of people, both in the stadium and on people's televisions, and hold some sort of opening speech. "Midoriya," someone called out, making the green-haired boy turn his attention towards the source. What he saw was none other than his ice-using classmate, Shoto Todoroki. "Need something, Todoroki?" Izuku asked calmly, stretching his shoulder as he did. Todoroki looked at Izuku coldly, not flinching a millimeter. As he continued to speak, "We all saw what you did during the villain attack, and I think that we all can agree on the fact that you're not normal for a quirkless person," he said with a cold voice. Izuku raised a brow at this, as he looked around to see what the others thought of it. Most of them agreed, and Izuku didn't need to use observation haki to see that. "Yeah, so?" Izuku then asked calmly, as his gaze slowly returned to Todoroki. The ice user didn't change his expression, as he said, "You're strong, I'll give you that, but I will still defeat you and take the #1 spot." The entire class went silent after hearing this, interpreting it as a declaration of war. Izuku, however, was as calm as before. He quit stretching, then he walked closer to Todoroki and said, "You'll try." With a cold voice, the class was even more stunned now. Not only had Todoroki declared war, but Izuku also accepted it with confidence. The room fell silent once more, until the loud bellow of an explosive blonde could be heard. "Hey Deku, icy hot, don't you dare leave me out of this. I will defeat you both," Katsuki roared, causing some to shiver. Both Izuku and Todoroki were unaffected by the explosive blonde. They just looked at him with identical cold eyes. More words were intended to be said on Izuku's part, but he didn't get the chance when President Mike announced for everyone to enter the stadium. The students complied happily, and Izuku decided that he would save his words for the opening speech. President Mike announced all the classes as they entered the stadium, crowds mostly cheering at the entry of the hero course. Izuku felt only a little nervous about standing in front of so many people, but kept it hidden when he imagined Rayleigh bashing his skull over it. "Now our freshman representative, Izuku Midoriya, will hold the opening speech," Midnight announced to the crowd, earning a few cheers. Izuku sighed as he slowly made his way up to the podium. Everyone looked at him, feeling a little skeptical. They didn't find Izuku that impressive, As such, they wondered why he was the representative. The green-haired boy shared a mere glance with the audience, and that was enough to silence them all. His aura was like a furious tidal wave, engulfing everyone in violent pressure. His spirit was strong, so strong that they refused to believe that he was solely responsible for it. Izuku continued to scan the crowd until his gaze stopped at a certain silver-haired geezer. He then took a deep breath and firmly spoke into the microphone. "There isn't much to be said, and I'm pretty sure that you're all eagerly waiting for us to start, so I'll just say 3 things. First, to all of you that are watching, make sure to enjoy watching us battle our hearts out. Second, to all of you that are participating, everyone's watching, so you better give it your all. Lastly, to my competitors, you can challenge me all you want, but I won't lose," Izuku said, before quickly pausing for breath. Everyone thought that it was a solid, wholesome speech at first. Then some of the students got annoyed as they heard Izuku say that he was going to win. The green-haired boy turned his gaze back to the audience before finishing the speech. "Let's have a great festival," he shouted into the microphone. The audience was silent for a second, until they began applauding the green-haired boy. Some of the other students were still heated after hearing the part about winning, but Izuku didn't care as he calmly walked away from the podium. "That speech sure was something," All Might muttered, unsure of what to actually say. Rayleigh heard his words and uttered, "Perhaps I ought to beat him until he learns how to write a good speech." With a half-questioning, half-annoyed voice, he wanted to hear Izuku say something spectacular and inspiring. But the green-haired boy had just told the audience to watch him win. The silver-haired geezer cracked his knuckles just as midnight announced the first event. It was an obstacle race. The students would race each other in an obstacle course around the stadium. Whoever comes first wins. The students all got into position, firing themselves up for the race. Rayleigh watched from a distance until he raised an eyebrow. He looked closer until he almost burst out laughing. All Might looked at the silver-haired geezer in confusion as he said, "Wow, Yue is very perceptive," before continuing his laughter. All Might looked a little more confused this time as he asked, "What are you talking about?" Rayleigh wiped a tear from his eye as he looked at All Might and answered, "I noticed the first obstacle, and Izuku is a lost cause if he falls for it." With a smile still on his face, All Might didn't really know what to think about this. He just saw a master smiling and laughing about how his student might be worthless, as if he knew what was going to happen. The skeletal man then snapped out of it when he realized that the race was about to start. Both Rayleigh and All Might locked their gazes onto Izuku, waiting to see what he would do. Izuku was calmly waiting, stretching both his arms and legs as he did. Occasionally, he used his observation haki to try and figure out what everyone else was thinking, but only found that most were showing some malice towards him. He also noticed something else: the gazes of 2 awfully familiar old men being locked onto him. But Izuku was unbothered by all of this, for he was only focused on his victory. He then got into a stance, prepared to start at any moment, until he noticed something odd ahead of himself. He noticed something about the corridor they had to run through. How narrow it was. He didn't need observation haki to know that the contenders wouldn't be able to fit in there. Therefore, it must be the first obstacle. "Start!" Present Mike roared through the speakers, and the students didn't wait for a second. Everyone began hauling towards the corridor, not stopping to think. This resulted in everyone cramping and getting stuck, all except for one. Izuku ran a little slower than everyone else to make sure that he wouldn't get stuck in the mass of students. After that, he simply jumped between the walls of the corridor, passing the obstacle, before he took off running through the rest of the course. The audience looked shocked, and both Present Mike and Aizawa commented on how Izuku managed to see the first obstacle. Rayleigh even smiled from a distance as he exclaimed, "My student isn't a lost cause." With a joyous tone, Izuku kept running, not stopping for anything. At some point, he realized that the other students had somehow broken free, and that they were hot on his tail. The green-haired boy sped up, not willing to lose his lead. Eventually, he came across the second obstacle, which consisted of the 0-point robots from the entrance exam. This came as a surprise to Izuku, but it wasn't enough to stop him. He simply used observation haki to avoid any attacks, and occasionally used armament haki to block any form of damage. Present Mike was impressed by Izuku's performance, as he commented, "Wow, looks like that green-haired student of yours is performing well. Just what type of quirk does he have?" With his loud voice, Aizawa sat next to him in his mummified form, as he tiredly answered, "His name is Izuku Midoriya, and he's quirkless," so that everyone could hear. Present Mike and the entire audience went silent after hearing this. They couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe that the person who had just said that he would win was quirkless. All was in shock, except for a certain silver-haired geezer who was smiling. Izuku kept going like nothing was happening, passing through the canyon no time. Eventually he made it to the minefield and decided to slow down to carefully walk and navigate through it. It worked for a while, until he heard an angry voice roar at him from behind. "Deku, get back here," it roared, and Izuku didn't need to turn around to know that it was Katsuki. He quickly used observation Haki, only to see that Katsuki was approaching him rapidly with his explosions. Next to the blonde was Todoroki, running on a path of ice. This sight made Izuku realize that he didn't have time to slow down, so he took off running once more. Under normal circumstances, a person wouldn't be able to avoid the tightly placed mines while also running at top speed. But Izuku isn't normal. The green-haired boy ran at top speed while using observation Haki to find the placements of the mines ahead of time. That way he could run without worrying about misplacing his feet. On the few occasions that he did misplace his feet, he used armament Haki to avoid the damage, while also using it as a boost. Todoroki and Katsuki were hot on Izuku's trail, but it wasn't enough. Eventually the green-haired boy cleared the minefield, and from there it was just a free path to the finish line. Izuku ran into the stadium once more, cheers and applause showering him as he got first place. Shortly after him was a furious Katsuki in second place, and a cold and stoic Todoroki in third. After some time, both Ida and Uraraka made it to the finish line, and they immediately began praising Izuku for getting first place. Rayleigh kept observing his student from afar, his smile growing wider by the second. "That training really paid off," he exclaimed, sounding as proud as a dark king on his throne. All Might looked at him curiously as he asked, "What kind of training?" Rayleigh showed his smile to the skeletal man, as he gladly answered him, "I put blindfolds on him while I bashed his skull open with a club. It paid off, because now he has improved his observation Haki." Before he laughed like a maniac. All Might's sweat dropped after hearing those words come out from Rayleigh's mouth. The way that the old geezer had said it made it seem like a joke, and that scared him. It made him realize that Rayleigh must be insane in some way, which in turn could have rubbed off on Izuku. The students quickly gathered, waiting for midnight to announce the next event. The R-rated hero spun the wheel until it stopped. The next game was going to be a team cavalry battle, and midnight proceeded to explain the rules. The students would make up teams. Each team would have a point value based on the member's placement in the obstacle race. The last piece of information was one that made Izuku shake on the inside. Whoever came first in the obstacle race is worth 10 million points. Izuku could feel how everyone stared at him, intent on taking him down. Everyone then scattered to build their teams, as Izuku tried to make up a plan. "So all I need to do is run away until the time runs out, and I'll win," he muttered to himself. "Yeah, that sounds about right," a feminine voice answered cheerfully. Izuku was slightly startled by the response, for he didn't notice anyone standing there. The green-haired boy then turned to face the source of the voice, only to be surprised once more. "Uraraka, what are you doing here?" he asked, making his surprise known. Uraraka looked at him with a smile, as she answered, "I came to join your team, Deku." "You said it, we win if we run away." With a cheerful voice, Izuku was about to question her decision, but was cut off when a girl came up and introduced herself. "Hey, I'm Mei Hatsum. I'll be joining your team," she said, without a care in the world. Izuku wanted to question her decision also, but was once again cut off by another person. That person was none other than Fumikage Takoyami. "Midoriya, will you let me join your team?" the bird-like teen asked, voice being as calm as the night. Izuku felt slightly overwhelmed, as he calmly exclaimed, "Can you all tell me why you want to join my team, knowing that everyone will target us at all times?" The three looked confused, until Uraraka answered, "I think it's better to team up with people that you know," with a joyful voice. Then Hatsum followed up by saying, "If I'm in your team, the cameras will always be on me and my babies." With an excited voice, Izuku calmly nodded at her statement, until Takoyami stated his reason. "You're competent, and you know what you're doing." Izuku was suddenly trapped in a state of shock. One wanted to join because of friendship, the second wanted the spotlight, and the third had trust in his abilities. Izuku couldn't help but smile at the results, as he said, "All right, building a team was way easier than I imagined. Let's win." With determination in his voice, the others smiled back at him, as they nodded in affirmation. After a few more minutes, all the teams were made and fully set. Everyone had their own plan in the works, and they were ready to go. "Start," Present Mike announced, once again prompting the students to attack. Izuku and his team were quickly surrounded by numerous teams, all going straight for the 10 million points. Looks like Team Midoriya is already in a pickle. What will they do? Present Mike commented, perfectly mirroring reality as it was happening. Izuku was completely silent, bangs covering his eyes. To the outside it looked like he was gritting his teeth in frustration, unsure of what to do. Reality, however, said otherwise. The green-haired boy raised his glare towards his attackers, showing them nothing but cold rage before he uttered, "You're all in the way." With frustration, Izuku's words were followed by a wave of spiritual energy firing and engulfing everyone in the area. It was strong, but not strong enough to knock anyone unconscious. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, and sound returned to the world once more. Everyone, from contestant to audience member, was completely motionless. The only thing that they imagined this to be was Izuku's aura, and it was terrifying. They didn't know how it worked, but the mutual feeling that it caused was to stay away from Izuku. Rayleigh watched this happen, expression stern, while the skeletal man next to him was practically shaking. Was that All Might tried to ask with a trembling voice, but Rayleigh answered before he could finish. Conqueror's Haki. Yes, but it's weaker than usual, he said, voice being as stoic as Izuku usually is. All Might was a little frightened by this sudden change of mannerism, while also being confused. Aren't you going to get angry about him using it in front of so many people? The skeletal man asked, still trembling a little. Rayleigh sighed, as if he didn't like what came next, before he answered, we agreed on something while training for the festival. If Izuku is to win, he needs to be able to use all of the weapons at his disposal. In other words, before he paused for a second, he can use his Conqueror's Haki, but not at its full power. He then finished. Meanwhile, Izuku's team was having it fairly simple. The use of his Conqueror's spirit at the beginning had made it easy for them, because no one was trying to attack them. This led to the first 20 minutes or so being uneventful. But that quickly changed. Out of nowhere, a huge wall of ice appeared and separated Team Midoriya from the other teams. They weren't alone, however, for the person responsible for the sudden glacier was standing not far away from them. The green-haired boy wore a cold expression as he stared down what seemed to be the only team that was unaffected by his spirit. There you are. Took you long enough to get here, Izuku said, showing no sign of falter in his voice. The bicolored attacker answered with a cold expression of his own, as he said, I'll be taking those points off your hands now. Before expelling a frosty breath, Izuku didn't feel intimidated in the slightest. If anything, he felt annoyed. He let the slightest hint of frustration bleed into his expression and voice as he responded to the ice user's claim. Let's see you try.